Oh boy, Karen. Mic's on. All right, it is time for us to get started.
I like the labels.
Yeah, you like that?
Yeah. Good evening.
John got creative on the labels. A little hot. Okay, so John Dean's got a mic. Mark has a mic. Sam has a mic. We're going to welcome Sam home from school by leading prayer.
Welcome back, Sam.
Yeah, you should have seen that coming.
Every service.
All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this day, the time that we have now to come and to look into your word and try to glean what we can from it and always strive to grow in our knowledge of you and understanding of you. Lord, we are so blessed to have this congregation here, and we're especially mindful of those that are still trying to come this way, and we just pray for their safety. We pray for any on the prayer list, and we pray all this through your Son, Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. I think John Dean should just make Sam all-time substitute while he's home. That'll work. I said all-time substitute while you're home. Yeah. All right, so we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Do not turn to Ephesians. That will be the wrong place. And as we get started, I want to remind us of this important focal point. The way that all of this is viewed typically is under the sun. And that's such an important filter to put in place before we go any further, because we typically look in a duality of worlds at the same time. We tend to look below the sun and above the sun, and he's really focusing largely under the sun. And so, in fact, in every context where you see the idea of vanity presented, it's a vanity that's under the sun. The wise man is not saying that things are vain in the spiritual realm. He's saying that they're vain in the earthly realm. So it's an important thing to just every class to remind us of as we go in. Now, having said that, the very first section here, I think, gives us great challenge, Jonathan, because he talks about God.
He does.
And, Chris said a couple weeks ago that we see these little, in gaming, they're called Easter eggs that are hidden along the way that are pointing towards the finality. And I think here there's a little bit of that. But there's also, while there's some of that, a tinge of that here, there's also part of this that he's kind of questioning some things about religion. And I think that's going to be difficult for us to grasp as we get into that. It's not all exactly favorable. Turn this on. There's the Slido. If you want to, it'll be a couple of minutes till we get to a Slido. But you can go ahead and get that pulled up on your phone if you would like to. So the thing, one of the things that's interesting, by the way, is, and this shouldn't affect any of us. I don't know if anybody's walking around with a English printed Bible, but our Hebrew Bible, based on Hebrew Bible. But in some Bibles, chapter 4 and chapter 5 are off by a verse. Some of the older manuscripts put verse 1 of chapter 5 at the end of chapter 4. And that's been corrected because it is a definite subject change. So it's just pretty interesting to bring that up. And I'm not sure we realize how difficult some of the divisions are. One of those that I think often is the wrong division is 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1. Really feels like it belongs with chapter 10. Imitate me as I also imitate Paul. And chapter 10's thoughts begin with verse 2. So we have a couple places like that, but this is one that's actually been corrected, which is pretty interesting.
I wasn't aware of that, but reading through this, getting ready for tonight, I looked at it and said, okay, does any of this connect back to 4?
Yeah.
And it looks like, no, that's a pretty clear break right there.
Pretty clear break, and that's interesting. So he begins with this idea of watch your feet. What does he warn people to watch their feet about? What are we watching our feet over? Okay, when you come before God, yeah. There's two sections tonight. The first of those in verses 1 through 7 deals with religion. And then verses 8 starts, and it'll go past verse 17, but that's our stopping point tonight, dealing with the idea of wealth and honor. So when he says this in verse 1, there's, when he says, guard your steps when you go to the house of God, it almost feels like this kind of idea of reverence until you keep reading, and it takes an interesting turn pretty quickly, because he quickly starts talking about sacrifices of fools, and being rash with your mouth in verse 2, and uttering hasty words. And so he's giving real warnings here. And that really brings us to the first Slido. I'm only going to give you two choices here, so it should be pretty easy. What do you think he's saying in verse 2? Now, verse 2 says, be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God, for God is in heaven and you are on earth, therefore let your words be few. Now, there's more than one way to take this. The two ways on the screen are predominantly the two ways that we interpret this. So you give your idea, and if you want to make a comment, that's fine as well. But
and kind of reading through this again, thinking about our class tonight, I read, be not rash with your mouth, and therefore let your words be few. And I figured I just would kind of keep quiet tonight.
Yeah, okay. Well played. All right. Whoa. That was I thought that was me for a moment. We're all awake now. So I have 100% so far with the idea that don't badger God with too many words because he is powerful. With 7 voting so far. I thought it was 8 and somebody's taken theirs away, or there's 8 now. So everybody seems to be on that one side. Anybody have any other thoughts besides that?
I apply a lot of his. If God has blessed this man with excessive wisdom, I feel like he's given us wisdom at times, godly wisdom at times, and I so many times I look back and I read it and I think of application from what we see in the New Testament. I think it's the same principle that James tells us, as far as it's very closely tied to being a doer of the word and not just a hearer and not a sayer, of Matthew 7, who says to me, Lord, Lord, because you can come before God and the fool will tell you what he's done, but the doer is going to be the one who guards his steps and is slow to speak, and actually is one to be careful to do the things he knows to do.
I could see where we might see that. I could see that. I'd also say that that's an unusual interpretation of this passage based on just typically what you read from the Hebrew perspective and from the way they interpret it here. There's
John?
Jonathan and then Marilyn. If we can get a Jonathan and Marilyn.
Yeah,
John?
I didn't prepare for class, so I was reading that for the first time as we were getting into it. And Chris really said exactly what came to my mind first, the parallels with the faith that I know of the New Testament. So
Okay.
I felt like that made a lot of sense.
Okay. Marilyn?
Well, this is a little silly, but the thing that popped into my mind was, don't be prudent about the things you bring before God. Don't ask God to help your football team win the game. Things like that. Be respectful of who God is. His thoughts are higher than ours, and they're foolish things that you just don't badger God with.
Okay. I will tell you that it's interesting that there's a lot of merit to both of these points on the screen, even though we totally side with one, it feels like. Because there's a phrase in here that's really important that we're overlooking, which is, he's in heaven and you're on earth.
Right.
And what's the point of that phrase, do you think? Yeah. Y'all think way too spiritual. for the mindset of this guy, because what he's really saying, because again, this is under the sun versus above the sun.
And that's tough for us to separate,
Yeah.
especially with this passage.
God's totally far away. The language here is like God's in a distant country. And that's what the language would represent to them, is part of this. And that's why the second one has some merit to it, is the statement, he's in heaven and you're on earth. That's not a statement of his ways being more powerful than your ways. He's in a completely different realm than you are. And this is where sometimes we struggle to see this language and when it's translated and understand. But that distance is a major part of this that we kind of just skip over if we're not careful. Now, that doesn't mean that he's, by the way, that doesn't mean that it's correct to assume that because of that distance he's indifferent. And I don't lean that way completely because of other things here in the greater context. But understand why some people believe that is largely hinging on this language of, he's in heaven, you're here. You're under the sun. And everything under the sun is what?
Vanity.
Vanity. And it's hard for us to realize, but that's the programming so far, okay? Now, I tend to lean the same way you all do because of the greater context. When you look at the greater context, it is the idea that, look, it's better to be close and be quiet than offer the sacrifice of fools in verse 1. Or verse 1.
Right.
Because they don't know what they're doing. So when you go in, there is a part of this that's a warning that when you go before God, make sure you know what you're doing. And then the second part is, don't utter rash words, right? Make your words be few. And what follows that up is the issue of vows later in verse 4. And vows are also a way of limiting your words. And why are they told not to utter vows before God? What's the idea there?
Right.
You got to keep it.
Right.
Now, and that's, so when you put all that together, and again, part of this is he's pursuing where meaning and value is. Here's the part that's difficult. Number one, part of this is not so much the idea of reverence for God, but the religion that man practices. He is cautioning against the religion. And when you think of it that terms, sometimes we talk about how religion becomes more important with us than our relationship with God. And I think there is a little bit of that going on here, that there's a warning about this becoming more of a religion than, in this language, being God's covenant people. Again, very hard, nuanced idea for us to kind of understand when we read it that way. But there's a part of that does fit with the theme of the book that we have to at least give some recognition to of the possibility. Chris, you had your hand up.
These verses kind of give credence to why I was thinking what I said earlier, because I think of, the fool is going to come and just offer a bunch of words. It's much harder to accomplish the dream or something that man envisions. It's going to come through a lot of effort. It's going to take the doer and not the sayer or the one who just, rambles on or talks about what they're going to do. And again, I'm reminded of the parable of the two sons when he says, be careful it's better that you should not vow than you should vow and not pay. I think about the son that said, no, I'm not going to go and work. And then he feels bad and he goes and does. And the other does the opposite. He says he's going to do it. He vows to do it and then he doesn't. And Jesus says, which one does the will of the Father? And they say the first one.
Yeah.
And so I see that theme kind of run through there, where it's better to be getting the mindset of, being the doer and not the one who just claims to.
Yeah. It's interesting that the context of the vow, I think, may miss us a little bit too. And the key here to understanding this is the messenger. Who's the messenger? The same word as angel.
the same word as angel, but I don't know.
Right. But do we think that it's being used as if there's a messenger, there's an angel coming around to make you pay your vow? Or do you think it's possible there's something else going on here? Culturally, at this time, if you made a vow to the temple and you didn't keep it, they would send a messenger out to you to force you to keep it. And so one of the things that's interesting about this is again, we're thinking above the sun and God holding him accountable, but the context here is actually, don't make a vow because then the temple's going to force you to pay it. And so there's a part of it that I can understand, just do things, but there's a part of it too that is this idea of the religion aspect, of the man-made religion aspect of what's going on. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this, by the way, is vows are not required. The vows are optional. But if you make a vow, then they become required. So part of his wisdom is don't make vows. Don't make the vows. And if you don't make the vow, then the messenger can't come by and force you to uphold the vow, right? But the point I want you to see is the messenger coming by to uphold the vow is not as much a messenger sent by God as much as it's the temple is making sure they get the money you vowed to them. That's the context. This is the idea, it's going to lead into money, but this is the idea largely of you vow to give a certain amount, and the creditor from the temple is going to come calling if you make that promise. You're better off to not make the vow, right? And kind of to Chris's point, you could just give without making the vow. And then you don't have the obligation. But why do you make the vow, by the way? Why do you make the vow? It's for honor. It's to get recognition. So again, this is where these little nuanced things that are said, if we're not careful, because we don't live in that culture, we don't understand what's being said, we kind of miss where he's going with this. Now, and he does say that if you make the vow and don't keep it, it's a sin. Right? That's a sin. Because you don't keep your word, that's sinful. So we see spiritual application in here like that. And we see that God would be angry. But I think what's interesting there is, again, why would this end? Why would you not paying a vow end with the destroying the work of your hands? Any thoughts?
God's going to collect on that vow one way or another.
Yeah, and the immediate thought here is when that messenger comes and you don't have something to pay, he's going to take something. And he's going to take something valuable that you've worked for. And you're going to have to pay it. And so it is very much the idea of paying this credit off, if you will. And then verse 7, so the idea of when dreams increase and words grow many. So this idea of when you dream up these plans and you make these vows and commitments, it's vanity. And this is where the key is. This is the Easter egg of the end. For God is the one you must fear. And his point, I think, through all of this is don't get caught up in the pomp and circumstance of the religion. Fear God. Now, there's some very real application for us today we can talk about later, but that seems to be more the idea, which we still get to the point of fearing God, by the way. But the wisdom here is that getting caught up in all these things as a form of your religion is vanity, because that's not, and here's why, that's not really fearing God. When you make vows to gain honor, you're not fearing God. You're serving self. And so that's part of what's going on here. Does that make sense to see it that way a little bit and to understand then some of those things? And you don't have to agree with me. I'm just asking, does it at least make some sense to see those things, where it can make some logical sense? That's the key. Any questions about any of that? Okay, let's talk about Jonathan.
I was just going to say, I think there's an application here that goes beyond, and when we're talking under the sun, beyond just making a vow or rash words toward God, but it's really toward anyone, especially
Yep.
someone who is in a position of authority or a position of power, who could call your bluff, for lack of a better term. That we will be held accountable. So when we are approaching one such as an almighty being, such as Jehovah God, or a ruler of the land, or whoever it may be, that there's got to be some discretion and some caution in what we say and how we approach it. That words can get us in trouble in a hurry. We've all probably been there for that.
Right. So there's a tinge, by the way, what we could call religious oppression in the vow taking and the reaping of the fields. But it's deserved in that aspect. Okay, you've volunteered for that. He's going to shift then in the next couple of verses to a different thought of oppression. And that's if you see, verse 8 and 9, if you see in the province the oppression of the poor, the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter, for the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. Now, I will tell you that last verse is difficult to translate. It's a difficult translation issue to figure out what it means. But what do you think these two verses are talking about here? What seems to be the idea in verses 8 and 9?
I'll say it's one of the probably most depressing passages I've seen yet in Ecclesiastes, that when you see oppression and violation of justice and righteousness, don't be amazed at it. It's almost like it happens. Don't let it surprise you. And that's one of the saddest things you come across in Scripture.
What's his explanation of the oppression of people here?
The system of man is set up to oppress the downtrodden.
Right. The system of man is set up to oppress. And by them, what he's saying is, you've got officials over you who are oppressing you, but the picture is, it's not just them, because there's officials over them, and there's officials over them. And and this is why the verse 9 is difficult, because it almost sounds like a good thing. This is gain for land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. It's like, well, the king's taking care of our fields then. No, the real meaning of that is the king's at the top of the food chain, and what he's after is your land and your cultivated fields. So he's pointing out the corruption of government. Essentially, that the bureaucracy above the people is all established in a way that and the way it works is, and we could talk about this today, it still happens a lot of ways, just in a different kind of system, but the king takes advantage of the people below him. For that guy to be able to survive, he takes advantage of the next guy, that guy takes it out of the next guy, and that guy takes it out of the people. And the ones that suffer from this chain of this hierarchy that takes advantage of wealth and oppresses people is the lowest person. That's who loses out in the end. And this is also a picture of the failed shepherding, I think, historically of just Israel. That the way God had set up and established was set for the poor to be taken care of, but inevitably what happens is they take advantage of the poor. And we see that as a repetitive theme throughout many of the prophets.
I mean, apart from worshiping other gods, that's probably the number one or number two criticism or claim against Israel throughout the Old Testament.
You often see that before the worship of other gods, because it is really one of the first signs that your relationship with Jehovah has broken down, is the way you take care of the poor, is that you don't love your neighbor as yourself anymore. And that's really important, I think, to see.
So even in a message that's coming under the sun, we still see the importance of justice and righteousness.
Right. Right. And we connect that justice and righteousness, loving your neighbor as yourself, we connect that to life above the sun. Right? We make that connection because that's what's pleasing to God. But he is just saying, under the sun, when people don't have that consideration, they don't care. And so all they care about is taking advantage of the poor or whoever's below them, and it trickles down. So the next slide we'll get into, this is going to be all about wealth. This is just an open-ended question. How does the preacher view wealth in the rest of this section? How does he view wealth? And I know the easiest answer to say is vanity, so we'll just throw that out there already. But how does he view wealth? How does he view wealth? And there's some interesting things said here. He's kind of already talked about vanity of wealth a little bit. But there's some interesting things that he says that almost seem contradictory to some things he said earlier, which is kind of interesting. Again, this is kind of like the catalog of his thoughts and his journey as he continues to look around. And so we may see some changes and some thoughts along the way that seem to be expounded or different than what they were earlier, which makes it pretty easy, or interesting, not easy, but interesting. So what are some things he says about wealth or money?
And as we consider his take on it, there's no question he was wealthy. If there was anyone qualified to speak on the pros and cons, the pluses and minuses of wealth, it's the preacher.
Right. So somebody said those with it are never satisfied. And that is a huge point that he's making. It can be evil. All great points. Some other people are typing. I can't get no satisfaction. Okay. We got a Rolling Stones quote tonight. It's that may be a first.
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah.
They were right.
They were right. Yeah. Absolutely.
And like the preacher, they tried and tried.
Yeah, they tried. Okay, here we go. Maybe we should hit a wall. Let's start off here that this idea of he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. Now, why is that, by the way? Because there's a part of us that thinks if we made just a little bit more, we'd be happier, satisfied. And he says that's not true. So, thoughts? What's that? Okay. If that's what drives you, never going to have enough. Jane?
Did you mention in your Sunday sermon that 30%, no matter, they went through a whole bunch of people, and from the very lowest to the very highest, said that 30% more would make them happy, and yet the people above them, they wanted 30% more.
Yeah, I don't remember that, but possible. Yeah. I don't remember what I preached by Tuesday. I'm already working on next Sunday.
I heard that somewhere recently. Maybe it was from you.
But it was odd, just,
Your retention is far greater than mine. I'm already talking about moms. But that's the point, is that people aren't satisfied.
They found that to be true. No matter what, typically speaking, are we satisfied with what we make? We always want more.
Or with what we have. Are we really content with what we have?
I think John had a comment.
Yep.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, money and abundance might still be two of the top idols that grab people's love today. That people find temporary satisfaction in and think that that's the key to a happy life. And no matter what you chase, because there are so many things to chase that gives you satisfaction, that might give you the false notion that this can make me happy forever.
Okay.
But there is nothing under the sun that will satisfy you.
Okay.
The older you get, the less the more you understand the lack of satisfaction is not important. I guarantee you it's going to die just like everything else. When you get to a certain age, you say, why do I want Marita bread? What I ate all my childhood. Well, it turns out Marita bread is just bread. And you don't learn that stuff at a young age. You want the things we see around the world, but they're all worthless. And they are. And I don't know what the answer is. It's a great tool of the devil. But, as I get older, I look back at my life and say, all those mistakes that I made. And then I look around the world, everybody else is making them too. It's only us who got God and Jesus with us. And that is hope. But all this stuff, I don't know.
So you're saying everything is vanity?
Yeah, I pretty much.
Charlie could be quoleth. I mean, that's,
That hadn't been
yeah.
a position that I would have taken, say, 2 years ago.
It's interesting in verse 11, by the way, he says, when goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with their eyes? So what he's really saying is, as your business grows, guess what else grows? What it takes to do that, right? So if you think about a farmer, let's say, as the crops get bigger, you have to feed more people with those crops because you're hiring more people. But the really interesting line here is where he says, the owner, what advantage has the owner but to see them with his eyes? What does that mean?
He's getting no benefit from it.
Yeah, it's
the
idea of just going through your hands.
Yeah, he's producing and getting no benefit.
Right. So he sees it, but he doesn't benefit from it. So,
Think about modern day with an entourage. Somebody that's got, say a football player, basketball player that's got $million checks coming in, but what do they have? They have all these people hanging on, wanting something out of them. So that bank account may show some money in it, but it's just going right back out to everybody else.
yep.
They don't get to enjoy it.
And he continues this laborer theme in verse 12 where he says, sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. So the laborer that just gets to eat but doesn't have the stress of the empire, if you will, he sleeps at night. But the rich man who wants more, who's responsible for feeding the laborer, he doesn't sleep. Right? So it's interesting here, and he's just pointing out all that comes with wealth, and he keeps that going to verse 13. There's a grievous evil I've seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt. And those riches were lost in a bad venture. He's a father of a son, but he has nothing in his hand. What is he saying there?
No inheritance.
Yeah, at the end of the day, there's no inheritance, because what ends up happening a lot of times with the rich is they have this hoarding mentality that ends up actually backfiring at some point, and they don't have anything to leave anybody because they hoard it all for themselves and they keep seeking more and more, and one bad venture leaves you with no inheritance to leave your son. That's the mentality here. And now verse 15, we get a glimpse of Job. And I think this is interesting. Job 1 has a line very similar to this. This gets into that question of is Job before or after Ecclesiastes and some of those questions. But there it says, as he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again. Naked as he came. He shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hands. This is also a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Now, if you remember, this connects all the way back to chapter 1. That the poem in chapter 1 starts off with this question of, what gain does man have for all of his toil? And what is he saying again here? Like, at the end of the day, man does all this work, and he has nothing. It just goes right through his hands. He has nothing to leave his son. Naked he comes into the world. Naked he goes out of the world. Can't take it with you. This also ties into the themes of death and no legacy that we've talked about. Nobody's going to remember him. They're not even going to remember him because there's not even wealth to leave behind to remember him by. So again, this is a very, very negative view. And what's really interesting where we stop in verse 17, moreover, all his days he eats in darkness, in much vexation, sickness, and anger. Now that is interesting because what has he said before you should do? What's been one of his conclusions in, I think, chapter 2, maybe chapter 3? Do you remember?
Eat,
Yeah.
drink, and be merry.
There's no meaning, under the sun, there's no meaning to anything. So when you work and you labor, eat, drink, and be merry. But now he's saying, here's a guy that can't, he's got a full stomach, but he can't eat, drink, and be merry. Why?
Yeah, he's worried about his wealth.
Right, because wealth has become his focus. That's the focus here. Wealth has become his God, if you will. And when wealth is your God, you can't even enjoy your wealth, is what he's really trying to say. When it becomes all that you're consumed with, you're never satisfied, you're never full, you can't sleep, and you can't enjoy even a meal from it because you're constantly worried about where to get the next check.
So there's a flip there, right? So instead of the master over the wealth has become the master. He is
Correct.
serving wealth rather than the other way around.
They're worried about people taking away from them. They're worried about every business venture. They're worried, just everything about it. They're worried about losing their wealth. That becomes their focus in every way. And can we be like that sometimes? My mom, when she moved in with us, she would call the toll-free number to check her mutual funds every day. And I would say, Mom, and she'd be, and if you've ever done that, by the way, you could call and check on them one day and they're down $500, and the next day they're up $700, and then they're down $300, and then they're up $800. And when it was up, she didn't say much. When it was down, it was woe is me. I lost $1,000 today. I said, stop calling. Stop calling. Well, I need to know. No, you don't. Just stop calling. Turn off Fox News. Quit looking at the market. And part of that's because, by the way, just this purely secular comment, mutual funds aren't supposed to be checked on every day. That's a long-term deal, okay? You're not supposed to look at that like you do stocks. That's just not how that works. But just stop. But we're the same way. We're constantly checking our portfolio. And I understand why, okay? But part of the lesson here is if you're not careful, that can consume you. And it becomes all you think about. And regardless of how much you have, it will never be enough when that's the way you look at life. Charlie?
All those things that we've pursued, that we all love and have enjoyed, I firmly believe that if you follow the Word of God, if you follow Christ, pick up your cross and follow Christ, there would be all the beauty in the world that you would want to look at. You wouldn't have to have a dollar. We're not of this world, and the whole challenge is to get away from it. And I'm convinced that if the more we could forget about all this stuff we worry about, better off we'd be.
Well, and the preacher is going to be convinced by chapter 12 of that too. That's what we're really seeing is the process of working through the meaning of life, looking at everything under the sun, so that he can come to the conclusion, and we've seen the tinge of that, just fear God here, but by chapter 12, the whole conclusion of the matter by the end of the book is going to be fear God and keep his commandments. That's what matters. The rest of it doesn't matter. And that's why that's why I try to point out the somewhat pessimistic view of this, just to see how much he's really looking at these things under the sun, how little value they really have. Because that's really his point. In comparison to putting all your trust in God, putting your trust in riches makes you a miserable, unsatisfied person. That's the end result of where he's going to get to, right? But in this little snippet we got, it's wealth turns you into a miserable person.
And in between the two, you can control your relationship with God.
Right.
Ultimately, you have no control of your wealth. Things happen that are beyond your control.
Absolutely. We've got about 7 minutes, so let's get to some questions here. What have you learned from the reading? Somebody share something you've learned from these 17 verses here tonight. Chris?
Well, I guess this is a comment that kind of goes through the rest of it. When it gets to verse 17, it says the one who eats in darkness. It's really a contrast with the guy in verse 19, because God has empowered him to see the joy in his labor. And
Yeah.
I think that's the guy that he's talking about back in chapter 3, verse 13, because when he says that every man who eats and drinks sees the good in his labor, it's the gift of God. So to see the joy and the good in our work is the gift of God, and it's God who obviously has empowered us to see that. And so
Right.
it's almost like he's contrasting the man who's in darkness is ironically the man who's seeing everything from under the sun.
Right.
But it's really darkness, because it's just like in John 1, the light comes in the world, it shines in the darkness did not come. The world is dark, and so
Right.
he's seeing it from that point of view. But if God has empowered us to see it, from his perspective, then we can enjoy it and see the good in it and eat, drink, and be merry.
Right, and that's a really good way to put it, Chris. I like the way you put that the world is darkness, and that's why so much of what this preacher says feels so dark, because that's his point. His point is all this stuff, and we remember a couple weeks ago I pointed out that we struggle with this because we think of life with God always. We think of a relationship with God and what that looks like. And we struggle not to think about what he says in that lens. But what he's talking about is people who don't have that. He's talking about people who don't have a relationship with God, that all they see is what they do in their life and first world. That's it. And one of the values of this is to just see, one of the things we should learn is how hopeless and lost people without Jesus are. That's one of the things we should learn from this book, is as he goes through these things. And I think one of the things that we need to learn is even the section on religion is something to learn for us in those first 7 verses. And I'm going to say it this way intentionally. If being Church of Christ is more important than being a believer and a disciple that walks with Christ, then you're the fool offering sacrifices of your lips in the first 7 verses. And that's really, I think, what that section is about. I think we want to make it better than it is, but I think part of what he's saying is that when you go into the temple and you make these vows, it's all about showing off and being God's treasured possession. But what is the story of the Old Testament? They bragged about that but never lived up to it. Because being able to say who they were and to act a certain way was more important than actually being who God wanted them to be. That is what the danger of religion is. When your religion becomes more important with you than your relationship with the Lord, then you've missed the point. And so that's one of the reasons why I read those first 7 verses that way, is I think that's a lesson we've got to learn. Because for some of us, if I had $1 for every person who told me in 26 years that they or their mom or their grandma were members of the Church of Christ, I'd be an extremely rich man, by the way. And you probably had those same circumstances, right? Or somebody come up and say, oh, I'm Church of Christ too. Let me tell you something. I'm not Church of Christ in that sense. I'm a follower of King Jesus. I just happen to assemble with a group of people that can be described as a church or an assembly or a congregation of people that follow Jesus. It's not a title. It's just a description. And we buy more into the title than we do the understanding of what it means to actually live within the description. We're practicing the same kind of foolish religion he's warning about here.
So we tend to look at religion more under the sun than looking
Correct.
at it from a godly standpoint.
Correct.
So as much as we struggle with thinking under the sun as we read Ecclesiastes, that tends to be how we think in our everyday life and how we act.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're almost out of time, but where do you fall short, maybe, in this reading? I know where I do. Yeah, yeah. I can't get no satisfaction either. Right? I mean, listen, it's really hard to find contentment. It's really hard. And
Because we're thinking under the sun.
yeah. I mean, and I get it. I mean, he talks about having an inheritance to leave, but he makes this comment that when that becomes your focus, you end up not having one if you're not careful. And that's a warning to us, right? And yet we're still worried about all that stuff. That's a huge one for me from this text. This idea, because here's the thing. You've heard me say this before, I know. We are the wealthy in the world. From the world standards, we are all wealthy. Now, we may not be wealthy according to the United States standards, but from the world standards, we are wealthy. But we're not satisfied. And there's a lesson in that. There's a lesson in that for us to try to get to. What have you learned from this reading? What have you learned? Only got about a minute or two. I mean, it's kind of maybe the same thing, but anything we've not talked about yet? Yep. Sam?
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, the world kind of pushes you to always kind of get them higher, get on the higher pedestal, get more money, any of that stuff. And you really see how that relationship with God is just so much more important. And, like, just God telling us, and we see how God could tell us that you just need to sit still and know that I am here.
Yeah.
You know? So
I agree with that. Yep. We're starting to see, we've seen these little Easter eggs along the way, these fear God moments, that are tucked away in this greater context of you do this, but you should just fear God. I mean, He is pointing towards the end to us, and that's important to see. Where do we fall short? I mean, I think a lot of us probably contentment's the